It has been clear for months and months that the deal on the table is for Israel to end the war in exchange for the hostages. And Israel has run away from this uncomfortable reality because, of course, they prefer to crush Hamas. And you can't, it had some rope, but the rope, I think, has run out after 9 months. You can't be trying to crush Hamas for 9 years. Okay, there's a point where you have to say, okay, we've done enough. And I think that is largely a decision of every individual Israeli. And if you read the polls, it's rather clear that 9 days into the war, most people in Israel would have said no. Don't do a deal ending the war, getting back the hostages. Instead, continue trying to crush Hamas. 9 months into the war, that simply has flipped. And I think the position of most Israelis and the position
67% to be precise.
Yeah, close 70% or so, would basically say, look, we failed to crush Hamas. Raphael, I don't think we should lie to ourselves. It would have been better had they been crushed. But the fact is, if the army pulls out right now, and that's the deal that's on the table, we shouldn't lie to ourselves. If the army pulls out, Hamas takes over again. Every part of Gaza that the army evacuates, Hamas comes back. And that's just the reality.
But is this a big surprise? I mean, when they came out and said that they wanted to dismantle Hamas's governing capabilities, I mean, we've even heard
It always looked like the two goals were somewhat at odds, but we were hopeful that they had, as Raphael says, some cunning device up their sleeve. 9 months into it, clearly it is what it is, and to a degree, the failure to create an alternative reality that is Hamas-free in the Gaza Strip is self-inflicted, because the same government has categorically refused every plan put before it to create an alternative. And now we hear that there's talk, there's no escaping that the alternative is going to be some version of the PA. Instead of understanding this and engineering a situation that leads to this, because both are bad, but Hamas is worse, clearly, the government has refused to do this for the obvious, transparent, and disgraceful reason that the government's main goal is to survive in power. And if they agreed to such a deal, the extreme right would bring down the government. And at this point, this dynamic, this paradigm that has paralyzed the state of Israel and is preventing currently a deal, clearly risks the lives of their remaining hostages. There's no doubt about it. So they should have the guts to tell the people, to look the people in the eye and say, yes, for us, our political survival, plus our goal, our reasonable, desirable goal of fighting on until we crush Hamas is such that we're going to sacrifice the remaining hostages, but they refuse to, obviously, because that would be in politics as well. It's a pitiful sight.
I have to confirm with you, Ron, that the U.S. administration's main criticism is the lack of an alternative that has been built in these last 9 months.
But they've refused to build, and there's been a lot of proposals on the table. Consider that early on, there was a proposal put forth by Jake Sullivan and by Blinken and by the Biden administration, much besmirched as they are by the government here for some reason, for a mega deal that would have involved peace with Saudi Arabia and a refiguring of the entire region, of taking this disaster and flipping it around and creating a better narrative. But that would have involved returning the PA to Gaza and beginning a process that, to a degree, could have really, I have to say, been lip service to start talking about a partition from the Palestinians and the Palestinian state. The government refused to do that, prolonging the war and endangering the hostages because of reasons that attach to its political survival. There's no escaping this reality. The almost tragicomic implication of all this, and I hate to use the word comedy in the context of such a tragedy, but it really is tragicomic when you consider that the reason Hamas will stay in power is the government, the very government that's prolonging the war to theoretically to crush Hamas, is preventing an alternative for Hamas because the extreme right doesn't want it. The extreme right wants to resettle Gaza with Jews, which I have to say, if in a lunatic scenario the government actually did, would mean that the area that is effectively the state of Israel, Israel plus West Bank plus Gaza, already would have an Arab majority. This is the level of strategic thinking that we're dealing with.
This Sunday, the government is going to be voting on extending mandatory service for male Israeli Defense Forces soldiers to 3 years. Now, that's only 4 months more than it is currently, and it might not sound like much, except of course we're in the middle of a war, and there's another war potentially looming in the north. What's the situation? What does this speak of? What does it speak to?
The military says that it's missing manpower in combat units.
And now we're going to potentially start a war.
And there could be another war in the north, which could escalate into a regional conflagration. What it represents is the end of the notion that Israel can have a small, smart army, because the days of major battles against large-scale foreign forces are somehow over, and everything now is cyber and intel and sophistication. So this also brushes up against the internal political debate in Israel about drafting the Haredim. There is about 60,000 draft-age Haredim that the Supreme Court has now said could be drafted, but the government won't, because it depends on the Haredi parties, again, for its survival. And so they're only going to send in a few thousand draft notices and somehow hope no one notices. And meantime, they're extending the mandatory period for all the rest of Israel. And the main thing is not the 4 months for the mandatory service, but the many, many, many months that are added on annually to reservists, who are people in their late 20s and 30s and even 40s, which is devastating to the economy and to families. And the whole thing is so dispiriting. We speak of this report. The Berry report is one piece of a bigger puzzle, and as Zach said, there's a need for a much more holistic understanding. But even just the Berry report reveals a failure on October 7th that is almost literally unbelievable. We use the word unbelievable many times, not meaning it literally. This cannot be comprehended. The report shows that a few dozen defenders were trying to fight hundreds of terrorists in this one kibbutz. Meanwhile, there were forces not a few miles away that didn't intervene because they didn't receive the order to, and it wasn't clear what their role was. And Tel Aviv is 50 miles away. And hours, 7, 8, 9 hours went by before reinforcements came.
Yeah.
The failure, just on the tactical, on the ground level, never mind the intelligence failure level, and the strategic failure, and the imbecilic,
and what it does
Bianca,
to the population.
the imbecilic decision to move most of the army away from the Gaza border into the West Bank because settlers there, backed by the army, were trying to stir up trouble. That is what happened on October 7th. The whole thing is so stupendously absurd that the idea that no one has yet resigned over it is mind-bending. This is not what should happen in the parliamentary democracy. And by the way,
absolutely
you have
not.
serious people here arguing that the Shin Bet chief and the military chief should not step down purely because they don't trust the government to not do political appointees to replace them. That is where Israel is right now.
Certainly a lack of trust in the authorities as a whole here in Israel, a very traumatic experience for the country that is still hasn't even really begun to start healing.
I've got to finish this job because there's so much at stake.
The coming weeks will show if the Democrats will keep supporting Biden or if the rift between the president and his constituency will deepen.
Now, still with me in studio to break this down is international affairs analyst Dan Perry and our very own correspondent Zach Anders. Now, Dan, I'm going to start with you. How concerned should Democrats be, both the party and the voters?
They should be very concerned that they're going to lose the election with almost absolute certainty unless they replace Biden. I think they are concerned. I think if you did a poll among Democrats today, if you did a new primary, you'd find Biden would have no chance of being elected whatsoever. The rebellion in the Democratic Party that you see among senators and congressmen and donors and celebrities like George Clooney is very muted because they don't want to look like they're forcing him out. That has its own political damage that attaches. But clearly they want him to step down. I predicted about a week ago in a column I wrote that he would, because he's a decent person and he must know. Right now, it's looking like I may have been foolish in that prediction, but I'm going to double down and stick with it. One way or another, Biden, I don't think, will be the candidate, because what we have seen from Biden in recent weeks, that he's been forced to go public, essentially, really has all the hallmarks of a diminishment of his mental capacities that basically wipes out his advantage vis-a-vis Trump. Biden's claim in 2020 was Trump is unacceptable. He's a pathological liar and a bit of a maniac, and that's not acceptable, whereas I may not be the world's most successful politician, but I might not be that great, but I'm acceptable. Right now, his mental state looks also unacceptable, and therefore you have Trump with all the, everything you can say about him versus Biden. Both are unacceptable. Therefore, his advantage has been wiped out.
Certainly a sense of panic for
they don't know what to do to get him to step down.
They don't know what to do to get him to step down, but also it is unclear who would take his place. Who else can come and take his place?
Harris could. Any number of, I'm not so sure, but any number of other potential candidates.
Well, Zach, I want to ask you. We talked about this just the other day.
I've been saying very quietly for weeks that I'm not entirely sure this isn't a play either, that this isn't, let's keep the focus on Biden, but we know it's not going to be him in the end, and give the Trump team less time to know who their enemy is.
It's a very dangerous strategy.
It certainly is.
I don't know. I think at this point, how this is just coming from, I guess, a rationale that I don't know exists in Washington, D.C. at this point, but how can you look at an 82-year-old, 81-year-old?
81.
And
he'll be 82 upon inauguration.
At the end of a second term, you're staring at, what, 85, 86?
Well, especially when this is his state right now. And anyone who wonders whether indeed it's a diminishment need only to view Biden in a 2012 debate against Paul Ryan. He was sharp and he was impressive.
If this is expectation setting and you now have the public getting used to, wow, Biden looks diminished and terrible right now, then you trot out a Gavin Newsom or even Kamala Harris, they're going to look fantastic, and they're going to have
people are going to unite.
Yeah, so I feel like this potentially, I've felt like it's potentially a play. I stayed up until 3 a.m. last night to watch that press conference, and my jaw was on the floor because I had just watched the NATO flub where he had called Zelensky President Putin. That alone, I mean, is shocking to global relations and going to be on Russian state television for decades. Then to go an hour after that to the press conference, which was delayed, to have the very first question in his response call Vice President Kamala Harris Vice President Trump.
Yeah.
I don't know how you recover.
Every appearance has more gaffes, and it's not. It's very clearly.
He's always had a few of those, but this is
not
at
like
a different level.
It's clear what's happening, and I have to say the Democrats would be right to feel betrayed because Biden made rather clear in the 2020 election that he sees himself as a one-term transition president to a new generation. Yeah, and at this point he's fighting tooth and nail against the obvious truth, and I understand it's painful for him. I'm diminished compared to what I was when I was 25, and it's painful for me. But a mature person deals with that. He is right now guaranteeing that Trump will get reelected, will get elected, will return to the White House. That cannot possibly be what he wants. And at the end of the day, I think the Democrats will, if they have to force him out, I think they will. That may have to happen at the convention.
All right, well, we'll have to keep an eye on that. We'll, of course, we're going to continue covering the story. I want here just a last quick question. Zach, what are we going to see over the next week or the next 2 weeks? Are we going to see an upheaval in the Democratic Party? Is it going to, like, a public one?
Yeah.
Is it going to happen quietly?
We see it all throughout the states right now. I think this has been a swell that's been developing for quite a while. At any moment, I think we could get a push alert that says there's going to be an Oval Office address. And, you know, the real thing that comes after, I think, is if he says he's going to stop and not run again, then all of the voices, especially Democratic voices that have come out and said for him to come out of this race, the debate and the argument kind of turns to, does he deserve to still be president over the remainder of his term? Because he is not running for very specific health reasons. And should he still be president for...
They might invoke the 25th Amendment. That's conceivable. The
He hasn't
Democrats...
met with his cabinet, they say, in over 2 months.
Insane. The Democrats have to move fast because part of the narrative that is emerging here is that they covered this up for a long time. At this point, they must project transparency, otherwise it'll hurt the party in a wider sense.
All right, this is the leader of the free world, right? That's what we call them.
Things are great.
Thank you both very much for your input and for being here with us tonight.